Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Mike Celia. I'm director of the Princeton Environmental Institute, or PEI, and on behalf of all of my colleagues in PEI, it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to our PEI Faculty Seminar Series, our first seminar of the semester. As many of you know, this is an unusual series in that the lectures are given by Princeton faculty, as opposed to typical seminar series where we have outside speakers. And we found this to be tremendously interesting and helpful to many of us on campus to get to learn about our colleagues and to hear fascinating research that's going on related to the environment. As is our custom, we will offer these seminars the first Tuesday of each month, with the exception being this month, September, the first month of the academic year. We will do this through the fall and the spring term. Of course, as you know, this needs to be done remotely and will be remote until further notice. By way of just a quick announcement, we'll also have other seminars during the semester that PEI will sponsor, oftentimes with co-sponsorship along with partners on campus. For example, next month we will have a talk co-sponsored with Brazil Lab that focuses on the current state of deforestation in the Amazon, and we'll also have a lecture co-sponsored with our friends at the Center for Contemporary China on the environmental implications of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and you'll be getting information about both of those. For this online version of our faculty seminar series, we've decided to include a moderator or discussant to help coordinate the question and answer part at the end of the talk. I want to note that you're all welcome to type in any questions or comments you have using the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will be disabled, so you need to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Feel free to do so as the talk goes on. I'm delighted to say that our colleague and fellow PEI faculty member, Anu Ramaswamy, has agreed to serve as today's discussant. As many of you know, Anu is the Sanjay Swamy Class of '87 Professor of India Studies and Director of the Chadha Center for Global India here at Princeton. So her focus on India, of course, is perfect for what we'll hear from our speaker today, who I now have the pleasure to introduce, and that is our good friend Mira Subramanian. Mira was the 2019-20 Barron Visiting Professor in the Environmental Humanities, which is a position that we offer within PEI. So she was actually on campus with us for most of last year. And she was, in fact, a great contributor to PEI, including offering terrific courses in our undergraduate environmental studies program. Mira is an award-winning freelance journalist whose work has been published around the world, including such places as Nature, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the USA Today, and many other places. I'll mention one series in particular that was published in Inside Climate News that was titled Finding Middle Ground, where Mira wrote a really remarkable series of pieces focusing on how Americans perceive climate change. In addition to her position at Princeton, Mira has been a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and a Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellow in India. Her award-winning book titled A River Runs Again focuses on India's environmental future and forms the basis for some of what she will present today. Please join me in giving a very big virtual welcome to our great friend, Mira Subramanian. Mira.
Thank you so much, Mike. Let's start my video and say hi to everybody out there. You're all over the place, but today, hopefully for the next hour or so, we can all come together and travel remotely to India. So I'm gonna, it's gonna be a very quick jaunt. We're gonna cover a lot of territory. I'm gonna show you a bunch of photos that I took while I was reporting on this book, and at the very end, I'll read just a few pages from the conclusion to wrap it up before I get to sit down and talk with Anu and field your questions. So the reason this book is entirely about India, but I just want to give you a very brief backstory on how I came to write it, which was, let's get my slides up. There we go. For those of you who might be looking at this in South Asia, just know that Elemental India is the name of the book there, same book, different publisher. So the reason that I came to write this book, what really goes back to that I have a very strong connection with India due to the fact that my father came to the US in 1959. And so he came to get a master's degree, first one to leave India in his family. He ended up staying longer and getting a PhD, which made his parents quite delighted. He also decided that he wanted to marry an American woman from Chicago, which made them a little less delighted. But I really credit him for having maintained such a strong connection. So we go to India frequently, every few years, as much as we could afford to go. This was my first trip in 1972 as a toddler. So each time I go, India was I would go and I would change, but India was changing too, and India started changing faster and faster. So this was my father's village that he was born in South India. But today you have the National Stock Exchange. In this time, especially in the early 90s, when India emerged from a semi-socialist economy, very insular, that it had maintained since 1947, since independence, it really opened up to joining in with the global economy. And so we had a huge middle class grew out of that, a sliver of elites grew out of that. You heard about the tech boom. But meanwhile, there were huge swaths of people that were and are being left out of this development. So if you look closer at the numbers, they're pretty troubling. I worked on this book during 2012 to 2015 was the main time. So India was looking at a population of 1.3 billion people. Right now it's poised to supersede China by the end of this decade. And of those, that huge population number, you've got a third that don't have access to electricity. And you have almost 2/3 that don't have access to fresh water, fresh, safe drinking water. You have more than 2/3 that are relying on biomass for at least part of their energy needs every day. So this is what, when you hear these phrases, bottom of the pyramid, you know, many times these are the same people that lack access to all of these, what are often considered in the developed West, basic elemental needs. So that was the starting point of trying to look at how to get the resources that people need and want. India wants to provide these resources to her citizenry. So how do you do that without ravaging the planet, right? Because what you have is India is a perfect example of a growing population combined with finite natural resources. So how do you get resources to people if they are finite? So sometimes there's a strong dichotomy that's set up between the sort of developed West and the developing East, and that or the global South. And I feel like that is a real false dichotomy. I mean, just thinking about, Mike referred to my series for Inside Climate News. I've traveled and reported all over this country too, and so many parallels struck me between what we'll be meeting farmers in Punjab. They were facing crises with their soil, that I saw the same thing with farmers in North Dakota and Oklahoma. Questions about water scarcity that we'll also explore today. Those are playing out in Texas and California, where wells have gone dry. So the systemic roots of pervasive poverty are paralleled between India and what we see, whether we're in rural Appalachia or the rougher parts of Newark. You know, these are parallels. So I think that the lessons that we can learn from places like India of how they're dealing with these problems, what's working and what's not, are extremely relevant. I also wanted to you know, I went looking for hopeful stories. I'm a narrative journalist. I went to talk to people and find out what their lived experiences were like, but I'm also very much into being a geek and following scientists around as much as I can and diving into the academic material to figure out also what is possible and what people are experiencing and how those two things come together and when they fit and when they don't and what that can tell us. So yeah, so I basically wanted to approach this in a very clear way of bringing these stories together. So I decided to focus on 5 elements as my framework. So I looked at the Panch Mahabhuta. This is earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The Akasha, everything that's in between. And so that was my starting point for approaching this. So let us, yeah, this is a map. I'll come back to this map for each section, but this shows you the breadth of India that I traveled while I was working on this. Still so much untouched. So this is just representative, of course. So let's start with the first element was earth. And for earth, I headed to Punjab. Let's see if you can see my mouse. This is up here in the northern part of the region. This is an area that is basically the breadbasket of India. Incredible production, nearly half of the wheat, a third of the rice. It's a major cotton growing area. I was there during the cotton harvest. And given its abundance, this is also an area that was really targeted during the 1960s by agricultural methods that revolve around what's called the Green Revolution. And so this is this was developed in the West, and the basic tenet is that it's producing using high yield seeds, so seeds that are developed specifically for high yield, combined with incredibly high inputs. So we're talking about high water, pesticides, and fertilizer use. And so the idea is to really put those inputs in and get a heavy yield. And that was incredibly, incredibly successful. Yields just skyrocketed in the 60s. And India was deeply concerned about this issue about feeding her populace because they'd had major famines in Bengal as recently as the 40s, you know, just really a generation earlier. So they really embraced these Green Revolution techniques. So that worked for a while, and then the yields basically plateaued. And over time, over a generation, you started seeing the effects and the costs that this heavy output produced. So water was in free fall. The wells have gone down tremendously. Chemicals are literally everywhere. Here's a bag that somebody was using that was made out of a chemical bag. Cancer rates in Punjab are higher than both the national and international rates. And there's the soil quality, basically you have to just keep putting the inputs in, and the soil in the meanwhile is being depleted as all of those inputs are going directly to the plants. So I went looking for farmers who were trying to step away, trying to get off of what they considered the roller coaster of the Green Revolution. And I heard a lot of stories. I met farmers like these 2 brothers who had split the family land. One was concerned about their health and their family's health, and they'd gone organic. The other one said consumers don't care. They want cheap produce available. It doesn't matter how it's produced. So I hear this like field half full, field half empty stories. Gora Singh was one person who really struck me, that he, very typical Indian farmer, small acreage, maybe 3 to 5 acre land holdings. That's what most of Indian farmers have. And he was basically transitioning his land acre by acre to a more organic methods. And so this means that he's working on developing the soil instead of just focusing on the plant itself. You're looking at the whole system. So he's trying to develop the soil. He's trying to use locally adapted seeds. He's trying to use local inputs like manure and other things that are available. He's using intercropping so that he's adding nutrients by planting certain leguminous plants that fix nitrogen. He's rotating crops, so he's not doing monocrops that are really vulnerable to pests and invasions. And all of these methods he was transitioning, and it takes a while to build that soil back up. That's why he was doing it in stages, but he was getting yields that were comparable to what he was getting with conventional agriculture that had all these economic inputs. So these were the stories that I was hearing. So then I would go to the science and say, great, this is what people are experiencing. What does the science say? Is there potential? Like every chapter, I had this driving question of what, like, would the world starve if they shifted back to these more traditional methods? And there's actually some really strong science to show that there is the possibility to do this. There's about 35 million acres in Africa where they've had double yields on land that they're using basically agroecology methods, which is looking again at the whole system and how do you make the whole system work within itself without constantly needing to bring inputs in from the outside. Likewise, the Kellogg Biological Station, this is a long-term ecological research station based in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They've been studying these kinds of things for a quarter of a century, and they're finding maybe you can't go organic, but maybe you can really lower the inputs and use the types of methods that Gora Singh was using, and you're getting yields, again, that are comparable. System of crop intensification is another method that's being developed that's really focusing on the health of plants and nurturing them along the way instead of broadcast seed, broadcast chemical approach. So this was all really hopeful that there is possibility here. And this is super key now, especially I just want to point out that when you're building soil is a carbon powerhouse. Only the ocean holds more. And soil, just to give you a framework, we talk about planting trees a lot, but soil actually holds more carbon than the air and flora and fauna all combined. So if we have healthy soil, you've got a carbon storehouse as well, which is, as we know, incredibly important right now. All right, so for the next element, oh yeah, Gora held up soil. He said, like smell it, like the soil that's not doused with chemicals, like smell it. It smells alive, and he's right. He's right. It is alive. So for the next element is water, and this took me to Rajasthan. This is a semi-arid region, so it's always been quite dry, but back in the 80s or so, it just dried up. The wells went dry. People couldn't support livestock. They couldn't support agriculture. Men were fleeing and going to the city just to get jobs, leaving women and children behind and sending them what money they could. And then this man, Rajendra Singh, started building at the behest of an elder, small johads, so small just check dams across the landscape. The idea is that India gets basically fleeting rains very quickly based on the monsoon. Rains come fast and furious. They often cause a lot of erosion. And the idea behind building these small johads, which you see in this image, are still being built. There are thousands of them in the Alvar district where I visited. Built across the landscape, they are capturing those fleeting rains. So you're helping them pause just a little bit and be able to percolate down and constantly be recharging the aquifer instead of just running out, taking topsoil with it out to rivers in the sea. This is also a great job producing scheme. They, the women there were getting paid to do this work. And this is, these small scale dams, sometimes they were small like concrete like this, sometimes they were earthen. Most of them were quite small, and what they are helping to do is basically by having that water recharge, the wells that had gone dry basically sprung back to life, and this area became vital once again. So the alternative to this is the total opposite direction, the idea of going big, mega dams, macro scale. India is right now working towards this with a major Indian River interlink project, and they're basically not only major large-scale dams, but also actually literally connecting rivers with the idea of getting water from one part of the country to the other. These efforts are huge, they're expensive, they displace human and ecological communities. They often come in wildly over budget and wildly behind schedule. So there's a lot of a lot of costs that come with going on this large scale versus the, there's a challenge with these large scale dams that we're also seeing in the US, and I'm sure many other parts of the globe, where they're just not, they're not designed, engineering wise, they're not designed for the type of climatic changes that we're seeing. We're now getting drier spells interspersed with heavy rains that have been not anticipated for in the design for many of these. And so there was a dam in California that actually almost collapsed, I think last year, due to these kinds of conditions. So instead, what they were doing here in the Olivar district is, this is a swale that catches water. This is a swale that these women are walking on that catches water. Uphill, there were 3 more, like a cascade. So basically, you're just trying to capture water everywhere. The locals also had an incredible control over this. They actually were doing it sort of illegally initially because you're not supposed to do it, and now they are praised for the work that they have done there. And really, it brought the communities back to life. People now, if they choose to leave, they're making a choice about that. This is incredibly important right now, just because of the situation with water right now is incredibly dire. This is a World Resources Institute map from last year. We're looking at a quarter of the world's population facing water scarcity right now, and projecting to get worse. I wrote about this last year when Chennai, which is the city where my family is in South India, ran out of water, day 0. It's the second time that's happened. They had to bring in water for a city of 10 million people with tanker trucks. So this is a completely unsustainable model. So how, again, do you control and manage water on a local scale across the landscape? And there are ways to do this in the rural areas like I just described, but there's also ways to do this in the urban areas that maybe we can talk about with Anu when we move to the discussion. The next element was fire. So fire, these are about 3 billion people around the world are cooking over open fires on some level or for some part of their energy needs every single day. This has a huge human impact. It has a huge climate impact. And in India, it's especially dire. I spent some time in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu for this story, but really everywhere I traveled, everywhere I went, I saw evidence, primarily women and children out collecting this biomass for use. Kids scrambling up trees to cut down any branches they could find. This was a house in Bihar that was covered with dung patties. You can see their handprints also being used for fuel. And so the impact from these fires is just it's kind of staggering. It's 4 million people, primarily women, but 4 million people a year globally die from the particulate matter from inhaling the smoke that's produced by these fires. And so that's to give some context. That's the same as malaria, HIV/AIDS. And tuberculosis combined, right? So we hear a lot about malaria and tuberculosis. You don't often just hear about the smoke from fires. This is, around the world. I think the WHO estimates about, in India it's about 500,000, and it's 4 million globally. So the impacts from this are intense. And who's getting the brunt of this? It's women and children, not only collecting the firewood and biomass, but sitting by the fires and tending them on a day in and day out basis. And we talk about these fires as though they're like, for a long time there was indoor and outdoor air pollution. Many places in India and elsewhere, that is a false distinction. It just really emerges. And the science shows that maybe about 20 to 25% of the outdoor air pollution is actually generated from these indoor situations of cooking. This is a picture of basically, it's called the Asian brown cloud. It's sometimes 2 miles thick of particulate matter. This has huge implications. So this has huge implications for climate. It affects agriculture. It's exacerbating the melting of the Himalayan glaciers, which in turn provide water for another 2 billion humans. These are all having effects. I wrote in the book primarily about rural situations, but I have written since for Nature about the situation in New Delhi. So that is, it's one of the worst cities in the world in terms of its air pollution. And right now, the whole American West is dealing with what this looks like and what this feels like and the health implications of breathing dirty air. As the pandemic unfolds, we are also seeing links between people who are really impacted by contracting the coronavirus if they have impaired lung quality. So you see all these things really coming together. So what's the alternative, right? Okay, so right, looking for the hopeful stories, the ways out. Smoke is incomplete combustion, right? So if you can burn a fire hot and clean, you don't have smoke. So this is the ideal. Doesn't this picture look amazing? This is basically a stove that's called a rocket stove design, and that's what would be ideal, right? No smoke. Instead, when I was going to villages, I was finding that this was the clean, improved cook stove. Women just weren't using the improved cook stoves, and they had their reasons. The scorpion hole, that helped the air come in, they didn't like that. They blocked it up with wood or a brick. They wanted to be able to use the wood that they had at their disposal, which sometimes is big, small pieces of wood. That means more labor. So they were really transitioning to. There's the concept of an energy ladder, and so I was beginning to see answers to this in the South, where people are using all different types of energy as they needed. Women had more control of their purse strings, so they were able to buy improved cook stoves and use them as they could. But they'd also use three-stone fires with the coconut fronds out back. Using LPG is, which is a cleaner fuel, but also a fossil fuel, is not a great answer just because they are still importing it. Right now, Modi is trying to expand use of LPG, but refill rates are really low just because people can't afford it. So could the answer be looking at things like moving towards induction, actually thinking about leapfrogging technologies so that you can, instead of incrementally moving up the ladder, just get to induction, a very fuel efficient electric base that maybe if used in concert with a renewable energy source could actually start answering some of those multiple deficiencies that we talked about in the beginning. Vultures was the air story, and this was really what started the book. I started working on this story back in 2005. So vultures in South Asia have experienced the fastest avian decline known. Basically, there were, 40 million, nobody knows, nobody bothered to count. But in the span of about a decade, starting in the 90s, the population collapsed. 99% of these three species of gyps vultures dead from renal failure. And it took a long time for scientists to figure out what was going on, but it ended up being diclofenac, a very common painkiller. Humans have taken it for decades with no adverse effects, but in the 90s, farmers started giving it to their livestock. And India is a very unique situation where if livestock dies in the field, the vultures were the cleanup crew. They were the ones who would show up and pick the bones clean. A real great service was because of Hinduism and the tenets of Islam, those animals wouldn't be eaten. So it was really important in South Asia, and they had this provided this ecosystem service, and then they were gone. And so this part of the story was all about adaptation of what happens when an ecological niche is vacated. I traveled around the north for this story. I followed biologists who were tracking the last remaining bits of the population. When I asked them what happens when there's a void in an ecosystem, they said, go to Rajasthan, go to the carcass dump. Okay, so bear with me, there's a couple gruesome images following. So what used to be eaten out in the fields free of charge, it no longer happens. So every city and town has formed a carcass dump to handle these animals. It's a food source. So at the same time the vultures were declining, the feral dog population was going up, and dogs are a much more health risk for humans, India being responsible for 1/3 of the rabies cases in the world. There were also religious implications. This is a historic image of the Towers of Silence which are used by the Parsis, which is a small religious group mostly based in Mumbai now, and they would lay out their dead for the vultures to eat. It was a very ecological system until there were no vultures and the bodies were laying out untouched. They're trying to use solar collectors, solar concentrators to basically desiccate the bodies. Hasn't been working so well. And many Parsis, such as this woman, are advocating for adaptation. So these questions of adaptation of religious and deeply personal beliefs is part of what we're having to consider in these moments. Meanwhile, the conservation biologists were trying to figure out how to breed a bird that had never been bred before. And they're doing an amazing job up in Haryana and other places. I was supposed to be going back to South Asia this fall to continue this story because they're just starting to release these birds, but it's still been really challenging to get diclofenac out of the environment. It is illegal for veterinary purposes, but unfortunately the black market is strong enough that it's still present in the environment. And then for the last story was ether, and I was looking at, I wanted to look at population, at the question of population, and this is a really fraught subject in India because there have been really draconian forced methods of population control that have been enacted there. But I went looking for choices. I went looking for where people might be able to make their own autonomous decisions around this. And I went to Bihar, which is in this area, and I went here because this is an area where there are some of the youngest child brides and some of the highest birth rates in the country. The girl is 14 here in red. She had been married the year before. And I focused, like I said, on choice. So I ended up following this amazing woman, Pinky, who was working with Pathfinder International. And she was giving just these short 3-day sexual and reproductive health trainings to teenagers in villages. And they were using randomized controlled trials to really figure out like what works. You know, her teachings were very simple, like stay in school until the legal age of 18, wait until then, wait until your bodies are matured enough. Here's how to space babies. IUDs do not end up in your brain. This is what's happening physiologically with you. They also found that the education worked best when the boys and girls were taught together, because this is really a matter of communication. This is a matter of, really, it ended up being a story about power. I really found that given a story of when these girls who had been trained and learned a little bit about their body and how to communicate about it, it was actually playing out in other realms of their life in terms of speaking up for themselves. So yes, to wrap up, I'm not a policymaker, I'm not a social entrepreneur, I'm definitely not an academic, but neither were many of the people that I met. And these are often people who are marginalized. They get the brunt of impacts, whether it's from cook stoves or climate change. And they are often coming up with answers of their own that are often not considered in thinking about the big global solutions that we need to solve some of the problems that we're facing today. And so just to wrap up, I handed in this manuscript in the spring of 2015, immediately after Prime Minister Modi was voted in on a landslide. He's been voted in again since then, and he came on a major platform of development. That's been good and bad. Some of those numbers I cited in the beginning have gotten better, at least before the pandemic, which is hitting India really hard right now. But there's also, like, there's been good and bad. Modi went to the Paris Climate Accords very defiant and wanted, you know, they have 1/10 of the emissions of America. So why should we be asked to carry the weight of this? But since then, since the US has really stepped out of that space, India is really stepping up. They are meeting their targeted goals. They are still moving forward on coal-fired power plants, but some of those have scaled back, partly because the economics are so much in favor of renewables, way over the stranded assets that coal plants are becoming. And India is poised to actually potentially exceed its Paris climate goals if it stays on track and decides to let go of some of that coal development. So, so that's been a pretty hopeful part of this story. But I think I just want to end by reading just a couple pages. How's my time? I've got a little over, so I'm just going to read a few pages from the book as we look at these girls and we think about how can we tap into more infinite resources. I often traveled between the places I visited by train. I would leave my seat and lean out the open doors, watching the landscape slip by as the wind whipped my hair. From that slightly elevated vantage, I could see the paths that people take. They are desire lines, the worn evidence of the choices we make every day. Byways braided across gullies strewn with refuse, and footpaths etched through fields of golden mustard, and passages disappearing into dry deciduous forests. Desire lines mark not where people should go, but where they choose to go. It is along desire lines that love or loss or hunger or need call them. Desire lines lead to junctures, and each time there's a decision to be made, where to go next. At this moment, India must decide what her future will be. Two paths present themselves as her development efforts advance. Macro is the way of the past and of the West. In 20th century Europe and North America, to develop was to go big. Rapid advancements in technology enabled humans to build ever more complicated systems to create energy, siphon water, and grow food. Megadams grew to such epic proportions that they drew tourists, big concrete, big steel. We split atoms to release previously unimaginable amounts of energy. Industrialization, not limited to manufacturing, became the model by which to raise meat and grow crops. These efforts were incredibly productive. They also came at untold collateral cost to the environment and human communities, and they have proven unsustainable over the long term. India could follow the West down this well-worn path of the big, wrenching every last resource from the ecosystems of South Asia and giving back nothing. It takes little imagination to envision such a future. Overhead will be the blackened skies of England in the mid-19th century, or America soon after, or Beijing yesterday, or New Delhi today. This addiction to the big will result in more dead zones where the rivers meet the seas. Indian rivers will run so thick with effluent that they burst into flames, as Cleveland's Cuyahoga River repeatedly did. Or India could choose the other path. Just as she created her own form of democracy, intrinsically Indian and not just a replica of the Western model, she could create her own way to develop her people and her resources. Growth could be guided by environmental self-rule. Call it Eco-Swarāj, something that only a few developed countries have tried on any large scale, and that is nearly non-existent in the developing world. Imagine an India in which innovation comes from the micro, where grassroots communities decide what they need and how to get it. A bottom-up approach to India's environmental crises can feed people without depleting the soil, draw water from wells without diminishing aquifers or displacing communities, fuel India's growing energy needs without wrecking the environment. The technology exists and is continually improving, and coupled with the traditional knowledge that remains, could be transformative. So I will stop there. Thank you so much. I look forward. I hope we get a bunch of good questions.
Thank you, Mira. That was terrific. I'm going to turn this over to Anu to start the discussion. Just to remind you, Anu is the director of the Chadha Center for Global India. She's also a professor in the Institute for International and Regional Studies, with joint appointments in civil and environmental engineering and in PEI. Her expertise is on sustainable urban systems, with a focus on India as well as other parts of Asia and the US. So Anu, thank you for leading this discussion. And a double thank you, because just as a heads up, Anu has to teach at 1:30 today. So I think she's going to quietly disappear at some point, but I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this, especially right before you're off to your next Zoom meeting, which is teaching. So Anu, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Mira, for a wonderful seminar and just the beautiful visuals. It was, it makes you homesick, and it, it gave everyone in the audience a visual of the creativity of the people, as well as the environmental challenges and solutions that they're exploring. And I really enjoyed that you took this broad spectrum view that covered issues, air, water, fire, ether, as you said. So I have a couple of questions, and then I'm going to read off some of the audience questions, and I'm going to welcome the audience to pop in your questions in the Q&A box. So a couple of things that came to my mind is, as Mike introduced me, I work on sustainable cities. And broadly, this idea of local self-reliance, how can we be locally self-reliant? And what does that mean in a globalized world? If you could speak to that, we're so dominated by global trade, but in the past few years, we've seen this populist pushback against globalization. At the same time, we've had COVID, and we know that we have to cooperatively manage COVID. And so maybe speak a bit about how do you see Swaraj, which is self-rule, right? How do you see Swaraj, globalization, and cooperation fit in together?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It's we are an interconnected global world. There's no way around that. And I think just the movement of people and the movement of ideas between people is just, I don't think we're ever coming back from that. I think what needs to be considered with this, like so many of the stories that I was finding, people were finding basically that Swaraj, that empowerment through control over things that had been taken, the control had been taken away from them. Just an example for the water systems, for example, like they were actually reviving systems that had been there before the Raj, before the British had come in. Local people would take care of their landscapes. And when the colonial powers came in, it was just like, no, you're not allowed to touch that. Give us taxes, we'll take care of it, right? And then lo and behold, it wasn't taken care of. And in the process, people expected somebody else to come and take care of things, right? And we still have kind of that lack of civic engagement that resides in so many ways all around the world, of just like someone else will take care of it. But if we start looking at that self-rule, that Eco-Swarāj is like, we can take care of our own landscapes because we know our local landscapes, right? That's where the power of that direct connection is. I mean, the macro has, the global part has huge power in things like creating standards that are used on a global level so that you don't have this disparity of one country being expected to carry the brunt of something that some other country has been responsible for creating, carbon emissions being the most obvious example. So, so I think there's a way for both of those things to come together.
That's wonderful. And actually that's the local to global linkages we're all looking to do. There's a few wonderful questions. Let me read them out. One follows the theme of Swaraj and talks about how Swaraj, the word Swaraj came out of India's independence movement, which resonates with political independence. This is a question from Mayank Mishra. And the question here was, how do these things interact with other disparities like caste disparities that our political independence did not get rid of for us? Can a decentralized and local help some of these caste and class divisions, or do you imagine it might exacerbate them? Great question.
No, that is a great question. I mean, I in spite of much information, I try to remain hopeful around these things in terms of them breaking down. I mean, what's happening in the US in terms of a reckoning of how much race and class overlap in terms of everything from access to healthcare to suffering from violence, there's more and more awareness of how interconnected that those things are very connected. I mean, I haven't read Isabel Wilkinson's new book, but I think this is an exploration of that exact dynamic, and getting into those systemic changes is how that will change. But whether there's definitely backlash. I mean, writing about the girls who I've never met such amazing on fire young kids as I did with covering that Ether chapter. But it was happening at the same time that there was like incredible rise in violence against women in India, very violent backlash. And so, I mean, the question that I didn't have time to get into is just like, is power finite? Can power only can some groups gain power only at the expense of power, or can people rise up together? And so that's a question we're all asking, and I don't know that there's an answer, but I mean, there's trying to be aware of the systems that are in place and how we can change them, I think, is the start of it.
A few more questions. We have several questions, so I'm going to cluster them together. There is a couple of questions on farming practices and food systems. So can India be self-reliant in terms of food? Actually, India is largely self-reliant already in terms of food, which is an interesting contrast. That was one question raised. The others were on the farming practices in Punjab. What do you think can be done about crop stubble burning? And how do you think about, what are the examples of the diversified, intensified farming approaches that you described? And how would they apply in India? So all of these are clusters of questions about organic farms, diversified farms, and how do you expect that, would they be able to feed the large populations we're talking about?
Right. I mean, yeah, that question about can we feed ourselves, it's definitely a hard one. A lot, because of the fact that so many of the farms are still so small scale, people are using them for subsistence level. I mean, have been thinking about this, just hearing about how many of the migrant workers in India have returned to their natal villages in the course of the pandemic, that people want to be home. Like, that's where they can, and being able to feed yourself when you can grow your own food is pretty fundamental, to at least have that option. Balancing that out with also economic opportunities and education and other things, it's definitely complicated. But the ability to diversify crops on a small scale level, where you get direct subsistence as well as sustenance, as well as being able to make a living, is a huge part of it. There's still not, like, the one huge gap that was happening in India when I was there was that there was no good certification process for farmers who were choosing to go organic. So while their labor costs would go up, their chemical inputs would go down, but they wouldn't get more at market, because, and that's where when I talk about the macro and how that can be really beneficial, is making uniformities, being able to track where things are being sourced from, so that farmers can basically get compensated. In the West, that is set up, and that is still just beginning to emerge in India, from what I can tell. The questions about burning crops, I mean, technically, it's my understanding. I don't know if this has changed recently, but my understanding is that it's illegal, but it's frequently done, and this came up a lot, where India has some of the best environmental rules globally, but the enforcement is where things fall through the cracks. So if there were enforcement of laws that are already on the books, we wouldn't be seeing that, because the burning of crops is a huge part of air pollution, and that both in the cities and rural areas both.
Right.
What was the other? Is there anything else there?
There was the question of small, like, can you do organic small scale farming and support these large populations? So the question of economies of scale, and is there a diseconomy when you go to a smaller scale?
Yeah, there definitely is an economy of scale. At the same time, half of India's population is still on small farms, like a few acres farms. I met one big landholder who was a 7th generation and also a politician, and he had, I think, 125 acres. So it's a completely different scale in India, and globally that's the same as well. That what we see with when I was in North Dakota, the ranchers were like having a small farm, a small ranch there was 5,000 acres. So we're talking about very different scales, and I think recognizing what's in place in terms of trying to support that system is what I think we forget, that people are living at different scales in different places in the world.
And related to this urban-rural question, we had another question about what is the the link or differences you see between urban and rural areas during your travels and more generally from observations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely the people are moving into the cities. I mean, I think that it's slightly heartbreaking on some levels. Like unless we learn how to support those villages. This is again exact parallel that I was seeing between India and the rural areas I was reporting on for the Inside Climate News series in America. Why is rural America so pissed off? Is because their communities are dying. They're economically not supported. They don't have access to other things. Educate. It's all intertwined together. And so there were definitely places that I visited in India, villages where there were old people and little kids, and as soon as you got to a certain age, you left town to even get educated, to even pursue education. So, I mean, whether we're heading towards this, like that, we right now are having a conversation, and we're all over the globe right now. Whether that is something, I mean, my father works on network management systems, and he was working on that in India with IIT Chennai. About 10 years ago, of really trying to figure out how to get that last mile connectivity so that maybe you could actually stay in your village if you wanted to stay in your village, and you've got food and family and human connections, but you're also tapped into something larger in terms of education and opportunity and jobs.
Great. So let me just acknowledge those who asked questions. So this was the question from Shriyanka Basak about the differences between the development in rural and urban areas. The questions on farming, they all came from Vijay Kumari Nunna. And we have a really fascinating question from Jerry Z, who's an incoming PEI faculty member just this year, and a fascinating question. And his question, he said he likes the breadth and narrative focus of your talk, and this question of proliferation of scales that's embedded throughout your talk. And how do we connect small scale bottom up and grassroots experiments rather than solutions from the West? So his questions, there's two, and I'll just read them out. So he said he's intrigued by the structure of the presentation or the book, which thinks about the 5 elements. Jerry works in China, where this is true. This is also true in terms of classical Greek figurations of the elements, that the elements are not standalone domains, but a map of transitions and connections. Can you speak a little using the relation between any of the 2 elements that ground the work about how we think about connections and translational relations to the other?
Yeah, maybe Anu, I can answer that, and we can maybe let you gracefully bow out so that you can go teach.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Anu, for taking the time, especially
Thank
right before
you
class.
For a wonderful talk. It was absolutely enjoyable. So I'm going to hand over to Mike and enjoy the questions. There's plenty of them.
Thanks, Anu.
Wonderful.
Jerry, that's a great question. I mean, I was fortunate to have come up with that framework of using the 5 elements kind of early on in terms of me getting my head around how to approach the book on like a craft and structural level. But the more I just spent time exploring the elements, I mean, I started with the Panchamabhuta in terms of the Indian Hindu idea of the 5 elements, but it is so universal, this idea of there being these elemental forces around our world. And you're right, it goes back to Greek mythology. It's basically present in almost every culture throughout time. So it's really, and there's the other wonderful thing is it's a structural way to think about things, but also the fact that they are so interconnected. Like just in the process of writing, it was like I couldn't talk about earth and farming without talking about water, and you can't talk about air without talking about fire. Like all the ways that they all just the sinews that connect them all just help remind us that we live in this ecological system, this entire connected realm.
Excellent. Let me just jump in here, and I'll get to a couple of more questions before we wrap up here. So. One that is bringing up the Modi government. You had mentioned this earlier, but Part of the question is, you also suggest that the Modi government is doing a lot to meet climate goals. Given what I know about the history of development and ecology in India, and this regime and its ideology, I find it hard to reconcile between your idea of Eco-Swarāj and the Modi government approach. Do you think Modi's party is likely to be supportive of Eco-Swarāj in a meaningful and inclusive way? How much sovereignty do local communities, especially given caste divisions, have over their resources to be able to self-govern?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I am deeply troubled by Modi's government in terms of the culture wars that are being flamed there and have been since he came in. I mean, it's when I first started working on this book, I was asking friends there in India, like, oh, does Modi really have a chance of getting support? You know, he has such a dark history in Gujarat about how he inflamed cultural differences and used them to support that India was a Hindu nation when it's not, and he resoundingly won, and the U.S. has very much followed. I mean, this whole rise of strongmen around the globe is deeply troubling, because there is, again, when you talk about these, like when I talked about just the legacy of colonialism, this is like the legacy of this like much more aggressive top-down approach to how we live on the planet, and it doesn't work. I mean, if you want to talk about economics, I don't know if it's changed now, but while I was working on the book, India was losing 6% of its wildly growing GDP to ecological environmental destruction. Like, it's just, it costs money. You lose money by raping the land. You lose your water, you lose your ecosystem services. You have to pay for all these things that used to happen naturally. If you're working with those systems, you get that money back. So anybody who's on like a pro-business platform should be embracing these things. Are they? Not so much. So yeah, I don't know if there is much hope with the approach that he's taking in that regard, but at least on the climate level, that they are pursuing the renewables, and that could be a bit of an example that I talk about hoping for in the book.
Yeah, excellent. You also mentioned a little bit about COVID-19. There's a question about how COVID-19 has impacted the environment. Is COVID-19 an indicator of some of our future environmental issues, given the sort of human contact with non-human animals? And I'm curious more broadly of whether you have an idea of will there be any significant changes in a post-COVID-19 India?
That's such a good question. I have absolutely no idea. I'm trying
Yeah.
to figure that out, even in my own country, and I don't know. I don't know what will last and what won't. I think it is a good reminder of, you know, to Anu's question earlier about the global systems versus the local. I think we were really starkly reminded, especially in the beginning of this pandemic, when those global systems just sort of shut down overnight, how incredibly dependent we are on things that are very far away from us. And we're like that without even recognizing it or acknowledging it. So whether that was a little bit of a wake-up reminder about the power of being able to produce your own food. I mean, I know I'm growing a big garden this year, and I think I've heard a lot of other people are doing the same thing. So I mean, thinking about how to incorporate that knowledge with building those local systems. In terms of the pandemic's impact, I mean, again, there needs to be access to the class divide and the caste divide are just so wide that the disparity between who gets to insulate themselves from impacts of these global pandemics or anything, it's disproportionate. It's exactly like what I talked about with the cook stoves. It's like climate change, pandemic. Globally, the people that are hit hardest are the people who have the fewest resources to deal with them. Yep. And that's a fundamentally wrong position for the planet.
Let me just pick one more question here for the sake of time, but I'll just read out part of it, which was, I was wondering if you noticed any interesting governance structures or social arrangements in the communities you visited that enables Eco-Swarāj to perhaps actually take place.
Maybe the most in the Rajasthan and the Alwar district, when they first started making the johads, they demanded full 100% participation of a community. So there was a nonprofit that was doing it. If villages were like, hey, we want this in our village, they would say, fine, we'll come and help you do it, but you provide 50%, don't quote me on these numbers, it was something like 50% of either like time or money. So every household was either contributing money or time. So there was investment on like a total village scale. And it did sound like there was maybe some strong arming going on. Like we'd sit in their front yard until they said that they were ready to do it, and then it would move forward. But just the whole idea about buy-in, that people like that everybody was invested in it and made it work, and therefore was invested in making sure it was successful. So I think that that kind of model was really inspirational in that way. Excellent.
Okay. Well, we have some more questions, but for those whose questions we did not get to, I hope it's okay, Mira, to say that it's okay to contact Mira directly with an email. I'm sure she'd be happy to discuss other issues that came up. But for now, join me, please, in thanking Mira for a terrific talk. It was a great way to start off our seminar series. I want to thank all of you in the audience for participating. I'll remind you that our next talk will be in 2 weeks. It will be by my colleague Peter Jaffe from the CEE department, focused on PFAS contamination, certainly the contaminant of most concern these days. And Peter's got a really cool way for dealing and decontaminating systems from PFAS. And there you see the rest of the schedule for the semester. Again, the first Tuesday of each month, as we usually do. Other seminars that will be on other days that PEI is involved with, we'll send you additional information. And if you have any questions or want any other information, feel free to contact me or Morgan or anyone else in PEI. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy your day, and we really appreciate you joining us remotely for this seminar series. Bye-bye.